Hi, I'm Jeff Hoffman, serial entrepreneur and co-host of the Explosive Growth Mastermind. I am here today with Brian Searcy. He's a colonel retired from the U.S. Air Force, and we're going to talk about a really cool topic today, situational awareness. So, Brian, start by giving us a little bit of your background.
Sure, Jeff, and thanks for having me here. This is really exciting. I entered the Air Force in 1987, got my wings in 1988 as a navigator, and I started flying for the Air Force.
What were you flying?
Flew AWACS, was my first assignment. I did that for just a little over 3 years, and from there I was part of the initial cadre for JSTARS, which is a platform that is actually with AWACS are supporting what's going on in Eastern Europe right now. Was with JSTARS for a very long time, 2 tours to the Pentagon, spent half my career deployed, commanded at the squadron, the group, and the wing level, and retired in 2010.
Where were you most of that time?
Was always in the States. So I was at Tinker Air Force Base. I was down in Florida with JSTARS and at Robbins Air Force Base. Like I said, I was at the Pentagon twice, Montgomery, Alabama twice for school. But in AWACS and JSTARS, we spent a good portion of our lives overseas being deployed and supporting operations that were ongoing.
Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take your story and lead us into what you're doing now. So let's start with this. What were your takeaways? And first of all, thank you very much for your service, and I'm sure everybody viewing really appreciates you giving so much of your life to us. But through that service, there's some key lessons you learned that led you to the thinking that you have now. Talk about the takeaways from your time in the military.
Right, so one of the key things you learn flying airplanes that you also learn when I also commanded the Air Operations Center. I was responsible for the operational floor, where we had op plans, but those op plans consistently had to change because we had to deal with what the enemy did. We had to deal with problems on our side. So you had to have situational awareness, but you had to know how to make decisions. You had to understand what critical thinking was. You had to know how to actively listen. You had to know how to communicate. All of these things were extremely critical. That's the first part.
How much of that did the military teach you?
Well, I'm very fortunate that my parents, and that's who's responsible to teach kids situational awareness and the 10 critical skills that we teach, they taught that to me. Unfortunately, that's not the case today. But I already had that good foundation before I even went into the Air Force. Okay. So that was extremely important. The other thing that is unique about the programs that we have at the Paratus Group is that we understand that traditional type training doesn't work. If you have a 1 or 2 hour class, people will forget 95% of what was in that class within a week. And it doesn't establish new habits, new behaviors. It doesn't establish a mindset. And you don't have a process to continually use those 10 critical skills that I talked about to continually learn and think about how you would react both proactively and in a response to be able to deal with the things that we deal in everyday life.
Yeah, you said some really key things there. Traditional education isn't about mindset, right? It's about memory. For the most part.
And unfortunately, the memory fails after a week. Yeah. Like I said, you forget most of that.
And you also said another critical thing, which is habits, right? I can pass a course, memorize stuff, without ever developing the habits that I really need to be successful later. So I think those are really, really important points. But so was there more though? What other?
So I was just going to say, and you led into the habits and the behavior piece. It takes 21 days to establish a new habit and 90 days to establish a new behavior. And if that's what is important to have situational awareness, because situational awareness using these 10 skills is a process. You're constantly analyzing and identifying things and making decisions. So you have to have habits and behaviors that go along with that.
And so tell us the difference, a habit and a behavior.
Well, a habit is something that you get into without being redundant, the habit of doing on a regular basis. So if you set a New Year's resolution and you say you're going to work out 3 days a week, it's that habit to work out 3 days a week. But then it's those behaviors, how you actually use your 10 critical skills, whether you have a process of situational awareness, how you are going to deal with your spouse or your kids on a regular basis. Those are the types of behaviors that you exhibit. So you have to combine those two things. So doing it over and over again, but then how you actually go about using the process.
Okay, so let's define for our viewers what situational awareness means in the broadest term that most people can understand.
Right, so for most people, situational awareness, they're thinking about what's going on around them. And unfortunately today, statistics show, this is not created by the Paratus Group, that only 1 in 7 people today actually have situational awareness. So that's a very, very scary statistic. So that means that they're not perceptive, they don't know what's going on around them, so you can't be proactive to stop something if you're not perceptive and you can't be aware of what's going on. And then if you can't stop something from happening, you certainly aren't prepared to deal with it.
So give us an example of today of somebody that's in a situation and what they're not aware of?
That's a tough question because, like I said, 1 out of 7 people today only have situational awareness, so that means 6 out of 7 don't. There are simple things that are out there. One of the examples that I talk about is I had a program where I was teaching millennials and Generation Z, so the younger crowd, at a restaurant chain in North Texas. About 60% of them that came in took their keys out and threw their keys on the table. That is a recipe potentially for disaster because everybody knows today we've got key fobs on our keychains. So if somebody swipes that key fob off the table and goes onto the parking lot, you either get your car stolen or that person is waiting by that car because they know now where your car is and you're potentially a victim. These are the types of things that people have never been taught. These are the types of things that people just don't think about. So you have to have a program that over time teaches them what situational awareness is, but even more important, that teaches them a process so they are consistently aware, and then even more than that, know how to decide and then act on whatever it is that they see.
Okay, so let's walk through your 10 skills so people have an idea of what's included
Absolutely.
in what you do.
Right, so the first one is being self-aware. And we talk about being self-aware actually has 3 components. That first component is knowing what's going on around you. That's the foundation for situational awareness. The second one is to know what you're capable of doing. See, most people that teach situational awareness or self-defense will come in and tell Jeff Hoffman, if this happens, this is what you're supposed to do. Well, if Jeff Hoffman can't do that, I just set Jeff Hoffman up to fail. So people need to figure out what they're capable of doing. And then finally, the last part of being self-aware is to know that your words and your actions will have impact, whether it's to escalate or de-escalate a situation or to solve a problem. In order to have situational awareness, and one of the other 10 skills is you have to be an active listener. Most people today listen to respond. I bet you've been in a conversation with somebody and you can tell they've stopped listening and they're just waiting for you to stop talking. Active listening is a key component. You have to be perceptive. You have to be able to see.
So perceptive is 3 now, right?
Perceptive is the third one. You have to be able to see what's going on around you. You have to understand that you have different perspectives than other people. One of the reasons why we have so many divisive conversations in our country today because people have forgotten the fact that Jeff and Brian can have different perspectives and that's okay. You have to know how to communicate. Communication is key in crisis situations or to de-escalate a situation. If you don't know how to communicate, if you haven't thought about how you're going to communicate, you're not going to be successful. We talk about learning agility. That's the ability to be able to consistently look at different scenarios or learn from your environment, recognize how things have to change, and turn that into a new course of action. You have to be decisive. Today, many times people will have some good situational awareness. They'll see what might be going on around them, but because they haven't thought about what action to take, they don't make a decision, right? You have to have empathy. If you care about other people and you've learned situational awareness in this process and you see things happening and you want to help other people, you have the ability to stop bad things from happening. And then you have to be humble. If you're not humble and realize that it's okay to be wrong or it's okay to still think you're right, but walk away from a potentially bad situation, today that's not what happens. You and I get into an argument, you think you have to be right, I have to be right, and all we do is escalate the situation. That's how bad things happen. I might have missed one in there, but those are the key ones.
Okay, so we touched on this a little bit, but most of these skills, most people never get taught. They don't really have a place where they learn most of these skills.
Right,
yes,
so
no?
the problem is this skill is supposed to be taught by parents. That's how I learned it, that's how you learned it. And about the late 60s, early 70s, we had a generation that grew up that didn't learn these skills. They really weren't paying attention to their parents, so they didn't learn these 10 critical skills, they didn't learn situational awareness. Next step is they become parents. Well, if you don't have a skill to teach, you can't teach it to your kids. So now we've had a number of generations that we've gone through this, and according to a number of publications and organizations out there, they're saying that about 92% of the kids coming out of college today don't have situational awareness or these 10 critical skills that they need to be successful in life, and that's a huge problem.
So you talk about what you created to solve this problem. The company, give us a little bit of the chronology of when you started this and what you're doing.
Right, so about maybe a little over 4 years ago, I was invited to join a group of about 13 other former law enforcement and military after a school shooting in Texas. One of the things that we identified is that when it comes to active shooting, 99% of the time people are just talking about the symptoms, what to do after the barn door's already been opened, right? So we put together programs to try and be proactive. And one of the key foundations that I use for that is the FBI and the Secret Service both say that almost every single active shooting event can be prevented because the shooter says or does something. So if somebody has situational awareness and then they know how to act on that, what to do with that information, you can prevent an active shooting event from happening. So what I put together for an active shooter events was a micro e-learning program that takes 90 days. Remember, it takes 90 days to establish new behaviors and 21 days for a new habit. So that micro e-learning, you get an introduction to the program, then for 90 days in 3 to 4 minute snippets, they're constantly being reinforced on what it is that we're talking about for situational awareness. So like I said, I built that for
And what is that called? What's the product?
It's Prepare for the Real World program. But that is what it's called now. Back then, it was really just for active shooter.
Okay.
End of 2018, going into 2019, I realized that while active shooter is a catastrophic event when it happens, it doesn't happen very often. But we have threats in our environment, in our schools, in our churches, in our communities that are much more in your face. We've got human trafficking, one of the largest criminal organizations in the world, sexual harassment, bullying. We've got cyber attacks that have happened here in the United States. All of these are threats that can be prevented if you have situational awareness. So now our program doesn't just focus on active shooter, it focuses on all of these threats and making people aware of these threats. Because we feel the way that we proactively can keep things from happening is we have to teach people what situational awareness is, we have to educate them on the threats, we have to educate them on the 10 critical skills, but then we have to provide a way for them to learn and develop the situational awareness and these 10 critical skills so it becomes a habit, a behavior, and a mindset using the process that we teach.
So the habit, behavior, the mindset, you mean when I go into a situation, right, I'm now consciously assessing all these things that I paid no attention to before.
Absolutely.
Right?
And like I said, I've taken a process from the military and turned it into a 5-step civilian process. And in the Air Force, we have a process called the OODA loop. It's observe, orient, decide, and act. And that goes back to what I was saying when I commanded the floor in the Air Operations Center. We know the enemy gets a vote. We know things are going to happen to us. So you have to constantly be observing, reorienting your troops, making decisions, and then acting on what you do. So what we've come up with is a 5-step process that is identify, assess, predict, decide, and act. And those are actually tied to Lieutenant Colonel Cooper's colors on situational awareness, which gives people the ability to have an escalated level of preparedness. So what happens with our process, we take the first 3 steps and you do that every time, everywhere you go. And it starts by anytime you walk into a location, you stop, you look, and you listen. So you're going to identify, is there anything in here today that I am concerned about, that gets the hair on the back of my neck, or I get that gut feeling, which, by the way, is a real thing.
The gut feeling.
That gut feeling, it's a God-given gift that we have, and we have to remind people that it's there. And in our program, we also stomp our feet and say, if you ever get that feeling, you have to trust it. You don't ignore it. So identify is the first thing. Is there anything I'm concerned about? Then the next one is assess. So can I go in and sit so that my back's not to the door? Do I know where the exits are? Do they have added security? Do they have cameras? All of these things are part of the assessment. I even take it to the next level where I take a look and see if there's anybody in there that if anything bad happens, I potentially can rely on, that I could give direction or orders to help me. So identify, assess, and then predict. What you're doing in this phase is preparing yourself by thinking about, okay, if something happens today, what would I do? So you're feeding your self-awareness, that second part of being self-aware, and you're teaching yourself what you're capable of doing in this potential situation. But the other thing you're doing is you're feeding that lizard brain that I talked about. You're feeding that library of actions, because you will only be able to respond to the lowest level of your preparation. So if you've never thought about what you would do if a certain scenario happens, then you won't know what to do and you'll be frozen and you'll be paralyzed. But if you've thought through dozens of times, if this happens, what I would do, and you've practiced that learning agility, now you can come up with the course of action, hopefully because you've identified it early enough to prevent it from happening, but by default, you've also prepared yourself to respond. And that's another key difference about the Paratus Group is most, like I said, companies come in and they teach you what to do after the barn door is already open. When we teach people to prevent things from happening, we automatically prepare them for success to be able to respond.
So a lot of that covered, and I think you hit the key point there, right? Which is preparing people to prevent instead of teaching people to respond. I think when the first time you and I talked, that was to me the key difference between what you're doing and what everyone else is doing is there's lots of self-defense as a response. Right? When someone attacks you, here's how you can defend yourself, as opposed to assess the situation so you never get attacked.
Right, so you can prevent it because you've already thought what you would do based on what you're capable of, whether, God bless my beautiful wife, 5'2", 120 pounds. She can't do the same thing if there's an active threat that I could do. So she's thought through what she would do. If I'm there, she'll let me know. If she needs to dial 911 or get security in a store or those types of things, she's thought through what she needs to do to be able to prevent it from happening. Another key part of this, though, that a lot of people don't think about is the ability to remove yourself or your family from being a threat. If you remember back to the riots that we had a year and a half, 2 years ago, a lot of people became victims because they didn't pay attention to what was going on in the cities or the towns, and they would drive down there and they would drive right into that riot.
Into it, yeah.
Instead of being in a situation where they did that preparation and removed themselves from being a potential victim by just not going there.
Okay, so a lot of this focus is around safety and crime, which, by the way, is a big thing, especially in this country right now. We have a rising crime rate. We have defund the police. We have a lot of things. We just have a general different approach towards law enforcement that's making it much more dangerous everywhere right now. So this is critically important. That's, again, why we're really excited about what you're doing, because people need to have this situation awareness in an increasingly more dangerous world. Tell me a little bit about this skill set outside of the safety part. Where else, because you and I talked about this before, situation awareness was helpful for me walking into my office, and even though I wasn't in physical danger, I still had to assess the situation to prevent things and to prepare things the way I wanted them to go in business. Talk about when somebody gets your training and develops these 10 essential skills and understands what situation awareness is, how else and where else does that help me in my life?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the key parts of the program, because for most people, they're not necessarily in their everyday life going to come against one of these threats. But chances are there are two other pillars that situational awareness helps with they are going to experience. So the first one is mental health, both your own mental health and the mental health of others. See, if you become panicked because of a pandemic per se, your mental health is going to be challenged. Sure. But if you have a process that allows you to think critically, make decisions, and not be panicked because you're prepared, that improves your mental health. The other piece that drives me crazy is the suicide rates that we have in our country today. Most people that commit suicide do something or say something that is an indicator to somebody that they're willing to take their life. With great situation awareness, and I'm not saying just being able to identify that they said that, but it's knowing what to do about it and then acting on it through the development of this process that gives you the ability to truly help somebody. And that's at the high level. Somebody's thinking of committing suicide. But I see people all the time in businesses and schools and in churches, and they could tell that something's going on with Dave, right? Mm-hmm. And they go up to Dave and say, Dave, how you doing? You doing okay? And Dave says, I'm fine. And they drop it. With situational awareness, and you really recognize that something's not going on with Dave, and again, because you've developed a process, you think about, you may not be the right person to talk to Dave, but who is the right person? Okay. Does he play football? Should the coach talk to him? Who's his best friend? Do you reach out to the parents? That's that point where most people fail, is they don't make a decision and they don't act on it. So that's the second pillar that situational awareness helps with. The third one is being a great leader. And that's a great leader whether you're in a business, in a school, in a church, or quite frankly, as a parent. One of the things that I talk about on a regular basis, and I've actually heard you talk about this as well, is most leaders of companies are managers and they manage by metrics. They're not working on establishing the culture. They don't know that leadership is a verb. Well, you can't be an effective leader without situational awareness because you can't identify those opportunities. Because leadership should be looking for those learning opportunities to instill in your team members the habits and behaviors that they need to have to be successful. Give them the tools. And that's the same thing with parents. Because of what I do, I pay attention when I go to restaurants and the grocery store, and I see kids all the time running around, and it's not until they've gotten to a certain threshold that the parent gets mad because they have to stop having the conversation they're having and deal with their kid. Instead of being a parent that is looking for those learning opportunities and addressing that behavior at the same time. I've recently been reminded about it. I've got grown kids, but I've recently been reminded about it. We have a 1-year-old now German short-haired pointer puppy. And they are devils, right? If you don't have situation awareness and you're not constantly taking them out of the bad behavior and putting them into the new behavior, you're not going to be very successful as they start getting older. So it's having that situation awareness, the willingness to do something about it, knowing what to do about it, and then acting on it that makes the difference.
So that kind of brings up the question, who is, for your training, who's the target? If I'm listening, how do I decide? Because I know you're going to say everybody needs this, but who is your target audience at this point?
Our primary target audience, however we get there, whether it's through going into a church and then getting into it, but it's the parents. In order to truly solve this problem, and I don't want to have a company and I don't want to have a mission where we're doing the same thing that's been done for the last 50 years, where we're following Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and not making a difference, treating the symptom like we've been doing. We've got to go to the root cause of the problem, and that's to get into the parents, teach them situation awareness, and then teach them how to teach their kids situation awareness. See, my kids never had a lecture on situation awareness, but they learned situation awareness by watching what I did as I went through my daily life.
Okay.
You know, it's that behavioral thing. I had a email that went out to the people that are in our program about 2 weeks ago, and in the meme it had 2 moms and 2 daughters. On one side you've got a mom and a daughter reading a book, and on the other side you've got a mom and a daughter on their phone. And the mom on the phone turns to the mom reading the book and says, "How do you get your daughter to read a book?" It's because she was setting that proper example. So parents need to learn this skill and then share the skill with their kids.
Okay, you're writing a book.
I am.
That's pretty darn exciting.
Well, thank you for writing the foreword.
Absolutely, happy to be honored to be part of this. Tell us about your book.
So it is Prepare for the Real World, and it is a workbook basically that talks to everybody about the things that I just talked about. That we talk about what is situational awareness. We talk about the threats. We talk about the 10 critical skills, and then we talk about the process. And there's a whole bunch of quotes in there or nuggets of information that they can use as they learn situational awareness, learn to develop their process. Ideally, what they need to do is read that book, because it's still that traditional type training, right? They'll read it in one sitting, but if they never go back and look at it again, they've never established those habits, the behaviors, or a mindset. So it's tying those two things, that together with our program, that is how they're truly going to learn and develop situational awareness.
Does your program have different types and different lengths of modules, or what's available to me if somebody listening wants to get involved right now?
Right, so the first thing we like to do is set up an event, because I like to have myself or one of my team members go and do about an hour and a half introducing what situational awareness is and going through what I just talked about. Then what they do is they enter the first part or the next part of our program, which is our 90-day micro e-learning program. So on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they get a video that's 2 to 4 minutes that's reinforcing what we taught in that introduction. Then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, they get an email that is talking about the real world threats that are facing them and the real world threats that are facing their kids. And that's one of the things that truly makes it personal. Jeff, we have a survey at the beginning of all of our programs. And one of the questions in there asks the people taking the program, how many of you have been exposed to one of these threats? And these threats are rape, sexual harassment, bullying, active shooter. Over 90% of all respondents have had that either happen to them or somebody in one degree of separation of their family. So you talked about how unsafe the world is. It truly is unsafe. After that 90 days, and it's 90 days because that's how long it takes to establish a behavior, they stay in the program for the next 9 months and they get 1 email a week, because these are perishable skills. I've got friends of mine that I knew 20 years ago that had situation awareness, that I've walked into a restaurant or somewhere and they're on their phone just like everybody else and they have no situational awareness. So that's why the program actually goes on for a year.
Yeah, I mean, I think you unfortunately really nailed it with the school shooting situation, right? There was signals out there before the child ever went to school with weapons, right? If anyone had assessed that situation. And then from the second it starts to the second it ends, I think there's been a lot of lives lost that could have been prevented because there was no situation awareness.
No, so absolutely. Like I said, the Secret Service and the FBI say 93% of all of those types of events can be prevented, and that carries over to all of the other threats. But you do bring up a very valid point that I would also like to make, and that's the response window. A lot of people think that if something bad happens, whether it's an active shooter or a robbery or an accident, the emergency responders are going to get there within seconds or minutes. The irony is that it can be 5 to 50 minutes before the emergency responders get there. So at the Paratus Group, we talk about how you and we are the first responders. We need to be prepared to respond. We need to be prepared to render not just first aid or CPR, but tactical medical training. People can bleed out in under 3 minutes while we're waiting for the emergency responders to arrive.
Actually, that's a really, really strong point right there, that most of us think when there's trouble, where are the first responders, right? And you just made a point, I've never even thought of it that way, that taking your training teaches you to be your own first responder.
Absolutely.
Which you are anyway, but most people, like myself, don't think of it that way, right? So,
and you empower yourself because you learn this process and the habits and the behaviors. Absolutely.
I'm not sure that it's not a tagline in there for you somewhere, become your own first responder. There might, excuse me, there might be something there.
Absolutely.
Because I had not thought of it that way, but you just made me think of it that way. So how do people find out more?
Go to www.paratus.group. They can always reach out
You can spell it.
That's Paratus.group. They can reach out to me directly at brian@paratus.group. And heck, give me a call, 940-231-3195. The Paratus Group wants to train 1 million people this year. We want to truly make a difference.
That's fantastic.
I appreciate your help and everybody else's help with this.
You bet. Your work is not just really interesting, but it's going to save a lot of lives. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Thank you.